What does it really mean to belong to the land? Not to own it, but to live as part of it? Well, for our indigenous peoples, land is not just a soil or territory. It is a life, memory, and identity. Good day, everyone. I am Mary Rose Iglesias Laranjo, a second-year BS Real Estate Management student, and today I'll be sharing with you my report on the Indigenous People Rights Act of 1997, or also known as the Republic Act Number 8371. Before we discuss the law itself, let's begin with a few reflective questions. First, who are the Indigenous people? And what makes them different from the rest of the population? And lastly, why do they need a special law to protect their rights and their way of life? Who are the Indigenous peoples? Well, the Indigenous peoples are culturally distinct communities that have preserved their traditions long before colonizations. They maintain their customs, language, and knowledge systems that are deeply tied to their ancestral territories. Now, the UN or United Nations and our 1987 constitutions recognize that these communities deserve protection, not just out of pity, but out of justice. They are part of our nation's identity and deserve equal respect. Now, here in the Philippines, these communities are also officially recognized under the law as Indigenous Cultural Communities or ICCs and Indigenous Peoples or IPs. ICCs and IPs under IPRA states that in Section 3 and Paragraph H of IPRA defines ICCs and IPs as a group of people who have continuously lived as organized communities on their ancestral territories, maintaining their culture, customs, and distinct identity since time immemorial. They are self-ascribed communities, meaning they are defined who they are. Their shared bonds of language and traditions separate them from the mainstream population. And that also makes them unique, but equally Filipino. Now that we understand who they are, let's explore how deeply rooted they are in our country's geography and history. Background and distributions. Today, there are about 12 million indigenous peoples in the Philippines, roughly 13% of our population. 61% live in Mindanao, 33% in Luzon, and 6% in Visayas. Before IPRA, they were called national minorities, but that term failed to capture their identity. They are not minorities, they are the original stewards of the land. For them, land is life, and losing it means losing who they are. Now, to better understand their struggle, let's look closely at what ancestral lands and domains mean to them. Ancestral lands and domains stated in Section 7 that ancestral lands are more than just a property. They are the heart of indigenous existence, encompassing land, water, air, forest, and all natural resources that sustain life. These territories are inherited from their ancestors and are meant to be passed to their future generation. Also stated in Section 7 of the IPRA upholds their right to own, develop, and protect these ancestral domains. One of the examples of these cases is the Cruz versus DNR of 2000. The Supreme Court affirmed that ancestral domains are private property under the native title, so meaning indigenous ownership exists even without formal land titles. But actually, this concept often clashes with the state traditional legal system, leading to complex issues about ownership. Next is the Regalian Doctrine versus indigenous ownership. Under the Regalian Doctrine, all lands and natural resources belong to the state. However, indigenous peoples believe land cannot be owned. It is shared gift from their ancestors and nature. The Supreme Court recognized this difference but upheld the native title stance, meaning ancestral ownership predates the governance claim. This decision marked a turning point in the protection of indigenous rights. So beyond their relationship with the land, indigenous communities also live by their own system of justice. So through what we call customary laws. Customary Laws Section 3F stated that customary laws are traditional rules that govern indigenous life. They are not written in legal books but are passed down through generation, shaping leadership, justice, and social order. Conflicts are often resolved by councils of elders, ensuring fairness and harmony within the community. One of the examples of this case is the case of the Sabanan people of Mount Kanatuan. The NCIP recognized the right to settle the disputes through customary processes, affirming the value of indigenous governance. Still, despite this recognized system, indigenous communities continue to face real threats and violations. Since we tackled about threats and violations, here comes the human rights concern. So even after the IPRA was passed, many indigenous groups have been displaced by mining, militarization, and large development projects. Tribal leaders have been harassed, and communities have forced to evacuate from ancestral domains. So this violation reminds us that laws alone are not enough. There must be genuine protection, participation, and accountability. One of these cases is the displacement of the Lumads in Mindanao between 2015 and 2019, showed that the continued struggle of indigenous groups amid armed conflict and mining expansion. To protect them, IPRA stands on both national and international legal foundations. Legal framework. The Indigenous People Rights Act is rooted in 1987 Constitution and aligned with international law. Stated in Article 2, Section 22 of the Constitution state that the state recognizes and promotes the rights of indigenous peoples. Also stated in Article 12, Section 5, ensures their right to ancestral lands. The IPRA also reflects principles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and ILO Convention in 169, making it part of a global movement for indigenous justice. Now, let's see how this legal recognition translates into land ownership through the issuance of certificates. Ancestral domain titles CADT and CALT. To formalize indigenous ownership, the IPRA created two titles, the Certificate of Ancestral Domain Title or CADT and the Certificate of Ancestral Land Title or CALT. This document legally confirms that the indigenous communities own their ancestral lands by virtue of a native title, not by a government grant. One of these examples was in 2013, the Manobo tribe in Agusan del Sur received a CADT covering over 11 hectares, proving that the law can truly empower indigenous communities. But before any projects or development is allowed on ancestral land, there's one essential requirement, which is the free and prior informed consent. Free and prior informed consent stated in Section 3G that free and prior informed consent or the FPIC ensures that indigenous communities have the power to say yes or no to projects in their territories. Consent must be free from pressure, fully informed, and given before any activity begins. So this process protects the right to self-determination. In these cases, in 2019, the residents near the DDPO mine in Nueva Vizcaya challenged a mining expansion for lacking proper FPIC. So, the NCIP intervened, halting operations until the process was lawfully completed, proving that consent is a right, not a formality. So, the FPIC is just one of the many rights under the IPRA. Now, let's summarize the 4 core rights and guarantees. four major rights under the IPRA. So the IPRA upholds four categories of rights. First, the right to ancestral domains and lands. Second, the right to self-governance and empowerment. Third, the right to social justice and human rights. And lastly, the right to cultural integrity. Together, these ensure that indigenous peoples can live with dignity, equality, and self-respect. So, to implement these rights, a special government agency was created, what we call the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples. Now, the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, or NCIP, serves the primary government body responsible for protecting and promoting indigenous rights. It is composed of commissioners representing the country's majors, also indigenous regions. So the agency acts as the bridge between indigenous communities and the state. Now, let's see how the NCIP carries out its important function. NCIP powers and functions stated in Section 44, 4 to 7. The NCIP's responsibilities include creating policies for indigenous affairs, issuing ancestral land titles, resolving disputes using customary laws, and ensuring proper implementation of FPIC. It also monitors development programs within indigenous domains. So beyond policy making, the NCIP's program aims to empower communities and sustain their heritage. So, the NCIP programs and implementation. Through its programs, the NCIP supports education, cultural mapping, livelihood, and heritage conservation. It also promotes the inclusion of indigenous perspective in local governance, also proving that empowerment begins with participation. Of course, any violation of these rights comes with serious legal consequences. Penalties and enforcement. Chapter 14. Under the IPRA, violators may face imprisonment from 9 months to 12 years and fines from 100,000 to 500,000 pesos. Public officials found guilty can also be permanently disqualified from service. So, these penalties emphasize that indigenous rights are protected not only morally but legally. Now, as we close this discussion, let's reflect on the true meaning of this law. Again, for this conclusion, the Indigenous People Rights Act of 1997 is more than just a law. It is a promise to protect the dignity, identity, and a future of the communities who have nurtured this land since time immemorial. When we honor their rights, we also honor the roots of our nation. Because when we protect their land, we also protect the soul of the Philippines. As I end this report, I hope we all remember that Indigenous people rights are not just a part of our history. They are living communities who continue to shape our nation's identity. Their culture, language, and wisdom teach us how to live in harmony with nature and with one another. The Indigenous People Rights Act reminds us that the justice means inclusion and respect means action. Let us stand with our Indigenous brothers and sisters because their story is ultimately our story too. And that concludes my report on the Indigenous People Rights Act of 1997. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Once again, this is Mary Rose I. Laranjo, a second-year BS Real Estate Management student, reminding everyone that respecting Indigenous rights means respecting our shared humanity. Thank you and have a good day.